The strangest thing about an itch is that relief can
Ah.
arrive by doing something that may irritate the skin even more. A mosquito bite can reduce a rational adult to guarding 1 square centimeter of ankle as if it contains nuclear launch codes. You resist, the itch gets louder, your attention collapses around that tiny patch of skin, and then one scratch lands exactly where it wants. And for a few seconds, it feels ridiculously good. That should be scientifically suspicious, because scratching is essentially adding a strong mechanical stimulus to skin that is already complaining. In some situations, repeated scratching can irritate or damage that skin further and contribute to inflammation. Yet in the moment, your nervous system can treat the scratch like astonishingly competent problem-solving. The itch drops, the urge loosens, and sometimes the sensation is not merely less unpleasant, it is genuinely pleasurable. So the mystery is not simply why we scratch. It is why irritating an irritated place can make the nervous system feel better about the situation. To answer that, we have to follow the scratch beyond the fingernail, because those few seconds of "ah" are assembled by a system running from skin and sensory neurons through spinal processing to brain reward systems and back into behavior. Scratching can change how itch-related signaling is processed. The relief can involve reward-related systems, and that combination may encourage the same behavior again. An itch is not simply a smaller pain with worse public relations. Pain and itch can interact, and both can produce powerful urges to act. But experimental work shows that itch-related signaling has specialized features, and that scratching can alter how that signaling is processed. You do not need a catalog of receptors to understand the important part. An itch is essentially a sensory message with something unusually close to an instruction attached. Something is happening here, and please do something to this exact location. That is why one tiny patch of skin can suddenly acquire executive authority over the rest of your body. Once your ankle starts itching, apparently the meeting is about the ankle now. The sensation has a location, urgency, and an obvious behavioral answer. Your hand often knows where to go before you form anything resembling a conscious plan. A useful analogy is an alarm system. The skin is not literally sending the word itch into the nervous system, of course, but sensory activity beginning near the irritated area tells the system that something at a particular location deserves attention. That information travels inward, is processed along the way, and contributes to the conscious sensation we call itching. What you feel at the surface is therefore only the visible end of a much longer chain, and that creates an awkward problem. If the fingernail does not remove whatever originally caused the itch, then what exactly changes during those few miraculous seconds after you scratch? One of the clearest clues came from experiments in primates published in 2009. Researchers recorded activity from itch-responsive neurons involved in carrying sensory information through the spinal system after histamine had created an itch-related state. When they scratched the relevant receptive field during that histamine response, something revealing happened. The itch-related activity dropped in the period immediately after scratching. The neurons were not simply switched off while the scratching occurred. In fact, many responded to the mechanical stimulation itself, but once the scratching ended, the ongoing histamine-evoked firing was temporarily reduced, and the effect depended on the state of the system rather than appearing as a universal response to scratching. That gives us direct physiological evidence that scratching can modulate itch-related signaling, while also showing why the phrase "scratching turns off the itch" is too simple. The control room analogy now becomes more precise. Imagine itch as one alarm channel arriving at the spinal system, while scratching sends in a strong burst of new sensory traffic. During the scratch, the control room becomes busier, not silent. Immediately afterward, under the itch-related conditions of the experiment, the continuing alarm is temporarily turned down. The wire remains intact, and the original trigger may still be there. That distinction matters because it protects us from an attractive but overly cartoonish explanation. Scratching does not work simply because pain walks into the nervous system, punches itch in the face, and steals the microphone. Scratching introduces strong mechanical stimulation, and itch and pain-related processing can interact, but the evidence points toward modulation of itch processing rather than one universal rule in which pain simply overrides itch. The everyday sentence, "I scratched the itch away," is therefore both right and misleading. It is right because the sensation genuinely can decrease. It is misleading because the scratch may not have removed the thing that originally caused the itch. The nail has changed the neural traffic carrying and processing the complaint. Think of it less like repairing whatever triggered an alarm and more like changing how the control room handles it after a
Ah,
burst of new sensory input. The underlying problem may still be there, but if continuing itch-related traffic is briefly reduced, your experience can change dramatically. That helps explain rapid relief, even though the mosquito bite, dry patch, or other trigger has not vanished. So we have explained why the alarm becomes quieter. We still have not explained the strangest part, why silencing it can feel like a reward. Because relief and pleasure are not exactly the same claim. If somebody turns off a smoke alarm that has been screaming for 10 minutes, you feel relieved. You do not normally describe the resulting silence as exquisite. Yet with a good scratch, particularly on exactly the right itchy spot, relief can have a distinctly pleasurable quality. Something about solving the sensory problem appears to matter to the brain beyond simply reducing the volume of the complaint. Human brain imaging studies provide an important part of the answer. In research published in 2013, scientists experimentally induced itch, compared active scratching with passive scratching, asked participants how pleasurable the experience felt, and measured changes in brain activity using functional magnetic resonance imaging. Active scratching was rated as more pleasurable, while scratching-induced relief was associated with changes in brain systems involved in reward, including parts of the midbrain involved in reward processing. The active versus passive difference suggests the experience is richer than simply dragging something rough across skin. When you scratch yourself, the brain is handling the itch, your action, its sensory consequences, and the reduction in discomfort that follows. There was a problem, you acted, and then the problem became smaller. That does not mean one tiny brain region contains a button labeled "Excellent Scratch." Functional brain imaging identifies patterns of activity associated with an experience. It does not prove that one structure independently creates the pleasure, but the broader result is strongly supported. When humans scratch an itch and experience relief, reward-related systems are involved. And this gives us the simplest way to understand the pleasurable part. Relief itself can be rewarding. The brain does not necessarily need to add a separate piece of neurological candy to the scratch. Sometimes the reward is simply that the fire alarm becomes quieter. If an action reduces an unpleasant state, that change can acquire value. A useful framework here is negative reinforcement. Despite the name, it means a behavior becomes more likely because it reduced or removed something unpleasant. Translated into ordinary nervous system language, the message is basically, whatever you just did made the bad things stop. Remember that. Another human study, published in 2014, makes the relationship even more specific. In that experiment, scratching the wrists where itch had been induced produced pleasantness, while scratching the dorsal forearms away from the itchy site did not evoke the same pleasant response. The associated brain activity involved reward-related regions, alongside areas connected with sensory and subjective experience. That does not mean non-itchy skin can never feel pleasant when scratched. In the earlier active scratching experiment, participants reported some pleasurability even without itch, although scratching was more pleasurable when itch was present. Together, the studies suggest that mechanical scratching has its own sensory qualities, but an existing itch, and especially relief at the relevant site, amplifies much of what makes the experience rewarding. So the pleasure is not simply fingernail equals pleasure. Context matters. The itch creates an unpleasant state, scratching changes that state, and the contrast between "this is bothering me" and "this is bothering me less now" appears to be a major part of the satisfaction. Biology, apparently, discovered the emotional satisfaction of dismissing a notification long before we invented phones. This is the expectation reversal at the center of the story. At first, everything appears to happen locally. Skin itches, fingernail arrives, skin stops itching, case closed. But the fingernail is only the opening move. Scratching changes sensory processing. Itch-related activity can be temporarily reduced under the right conditions, and the resulting relief is processed by a brain containing systems involved in reward, action, and learning. What feels like a tiny dermatological event is therefore a conversation between skin, sensory neurons, spinal processing, brain, and behavior. And once behavior enters the story, the next step becomes almost inevitable. If scratching reduces an unpleasant sensation, and that reduction is rewarding, then scratching can become reinforced. The next time an itch appears, your nervous system already has a candidate action with a very respectable resume. Scratching worked before, so scratching is worth trying again. You do not need to stand over a mosquito bite and calculate a cost-benefit ratio. Reinforcement can emerge because actions have consequences. When a behavior is followed by relief, it can become easier to select when the same unpleasant state returns. That does not mean every itch creates a self-sustaining loop, or that ordinary scratching is an addiction. It means short-term relief can help explain why scratching becomes hard to resist when an itch persists. This is where dopamine enters the story, and also where popular explanations can become much more confident than the evidence allows. In mouse experiments published in 2021, itch-driven scratching was associated with increased extracellular dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, part of a reward-related system. Researchers also used experimental techniques to suppress mesolimbic dopaminergic neurons, and scratching behavior decreased. That provides causal evidence in animals that mesolimbic dopamine pathways can influence itch-driven scratching. But those were mouse experiments. They do not allow us to say that every human scratch produces a dopamine hit. Human evidence mainly shows that reward-related systems participate in scratching-induced relief and pleasure. Animal experiments allow more direct causal tests. The findings support parts of the same picture, but they are not interchangeable. The distinction matters because reward is not automatically dopamine, dopamine is not automatically pleasure, and reinforcement is not automatically addiction. Those concepts can overlap, but treating them as synonyms turns a complicated nervous system into a very confident motivational poster. What the evidence does give us is something subtler and more useful. Scratching can solve an immediate sensory problem, the improvement can acquire value, and reward-related circuitry can influence itch-driven scratching behavior. That is already enough to make repetition understandable, which would be an elegant system if scratching only solved problems. Unfortunately, the skin gets a vote too. When itching is prolonged or inflammatory, repeated scratching can irritate or damage the skin and contribute to inflammatory signaling. That can create the familiar itch and scratch cycle. The itch encourages scratching, scratching provides relief, relief encourages repetition, but repeated scratching may also contribute to irritation that helps generate more itching later. The beautifully annoying thing about this system is that every step makes sense locally. The skin feels bad. Scratching changes how the signal is processed. The experience improves. The brain values the improvement. Repeating the action becomes easier. From the perspective of the next 5 seconds, this is excellent management. The problem is that biology does not always optimize the next 5 seconds and the next 5 days in exactly the same way. The reward arrives quickly. Some of the costs can arrive later. Once those timescales are separated, the apparent contradiction begins to disappear. An action can be effective at relieving the current sensation without guaranteeing that repeatedly performing it will improve the condition of the tissue underneath. Recent experimental work makes this trade-off even more interesting. In a mouse model reported in 2025, scratching promoted allergic skin inflammation through neuroimmune mechanisms. So there is experimental evidence that scratching can intensify inflammatory processes in that particular context. But in the same mouse study, scratching also improved defense against a superficial bacterial skin infection. So the conclusion is not simply, scratching is bad. Biology has, as usual, taken a clean moral lesson and replaced it with a trade-off. Its consequences depended on the biological context being studied. What we cannot do is leap from that result to a grand evolutionary story and declare that humans scratch because scratching kills microbes. An observed host defense effect in an experimental model is not proof of an evolved purpose. Nor does evidence that scratching can promote inflammation in one experimental setting mean that every scratch is harmful. The safer conclusion is narrower and more interesting. Scratching can provide short-term sensory relief while also producing context-dependent effects on inflammation and host defense. This is also where the limits of the science matter. No single universal circuit has been shown to explain every kind of itch and scratching. Acute laboratory itch is not identical to chronic itch. A mouse model is not a human experience, and the experiments we have discussed answer different questions. A useful way to picture the evidence is as several cameras aimed at different parts of the same broad biological problem. Primate neuron recordings show how itch-related activity changes around scratching. Human imaging shows systems associated with relief and pleasure. Mouse experiments let researchers manipulate reward circuitry and test whether scratching behavior changes. These lines of evidence are not interchangeable across species. Each answers a different part of the question. No single experiment gives us the whole explanation by itself. Taken together, however, these different lines of evidence produce a surprisingly coherent story. An itch begins as sensory information that produces an urge. Scratching introduces a strong new sensory signal and, under itch-related conditions, can be followed by temporary suppression of part of the ongoing itch-related activity. Relief follows. In humans, that relief can be pleasurable and is associated with activity in reward-related systems. Animal experiments provide additional evidence that reward circuitry, including dopamine pathways, can influence itch-driven scratching. Then the consequence of the action feeds back into behavior, making scratching easier to repeat when the unpleasant sensation returns. So why does scratching an itch feel so good, even though scratching can irritate the skin? Because the pleasure is not simply your skin enjoying being scraped. Scratching can temporarily change the neural processing of itch, reducing an unpleasant sensation, and that relief involves systems that assign value to rewarding outcomes. In that context, the relief can reinforce the action, making scratching more likely to be selected again when the itch returns. The catch is that short-term relief and long-term benefit are not always the same thing. The next time a mosquito bite turns 1 square centimeter of your ankle into the administrative center of human civilization, the satisfying scratch will still feel wonderfully local. Fingernail meets skin. The itch drops. Problem solved. Except now you can see the invisible machinery behind those few seconds. The skin raises an alarm. Sensory pathways carry the complaint inward. Scratching adds a powerful new stream of sensory information and changes how the continuing itch signal is processed. The brain registers the relief as valuable. That relief can help reinforce the successful action. And if the loop continues under the wrong conditions, the irritated skin may eventually send the alarm all over again. Your fingernail gets the credit, but the nervous system wrote the review. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about the humble scratch. It feels good because your nervous system rewards the silence, even when the skin may later pay the bill. If ordinary things becoming deeply weird the moment you look closely sounds like your kind of problem, subscribe to Oddplain. Apparently, repeated rewarding behavior is something the nervous system understands very well.